Hello, Brobs. We're back with Anyone's Son, a true story of the murder of the Harry de la Roche family, written by Roberta Roche with help from the murderer, Harry de la Roche Jr. This is Chapter 2, Part 3. I don't know why they have these sections like this, but this is, I don't know why they've done it. This is the second part. It just says 2, obviously, whatever, doesn't matter. This is the third section of this book, but the second chapter, second part of the book. I don't understand why they did that. But as I look back from where I am now to the stories my mother told me, I suppose my premature start in life may well have been the first imperfection in the perfect family image my father hoped to create. He always wanted the best for his sons from our earliest days, and certainly my plucked chicken look wasn't what he had in mind. But I guess all parents have great hope, especially for their firstborn. So my mother kept records of my progress for the weeks I was hospitalized. I later saw my baby book, and when I got to 4 pounds and 5 ounces, she wrote with an exclamation point, "He's out of the incubator today. We can have him when he weighs 5 pounds." By the time my parents brought me home, my father was working for Ford, and since he was ambitious, he'd already enrolled in Seton Hall University and was going to college at night. As a father, Dad had strong ideas on what a boy should be, so as long as I can remember, he was strict and conservative. In a way, I was like a proving ground since I was his oldest son. I was short and thin as a child, and for my first few years, I was plagued with medical problems and my share of misadventures. My biggest problem was hearing, and my ears were so sensitive that even the click of a light switch would start me screaming in pain. I also had a constant sore throat, so by the time I was 4, I was back in the hospital for an ear and throat operation. The following year, I was hospitalized for bronchitis and breathing problems. Because of these experiences, I was afraid of doctors, and whenever I had to have a shot, 2 people had to hold me down. I can still remember those needles, and I'd get so sick on the way to the doctors, my father would have to stop the car so I could get out and throw up. Our misadventure that sticks in my mind is barely escaping an accident with a bulldozer in Lodi. A demolition company was tearing down brick buildings, and since there were piles of bricks around, the people were free to take. My mother and a friend were collecting some to build a patio. Unbeknown to them, I wandered away, and when a bulldozer was so close the driver couldn't see me, I caught my foot in a layer of bricks and couldn't get it loose. Luckily, my mother's friend heard me scream and rescued me just in time. That same day, I touched a bee's nest, and a bee stung me on my eye. Then, later at my grandparents' house, my grandfather swung me around playfully, and I accidentally hit the other eye on the side of a table. That wasn't a very good day. In Lodi, I had my first beating up and also my first experience with female temper tantrums. It happened when a girl got mad and hit me with a baseball bat. At home, I encountered a temper too because my father, along with his discipline, had a violent temper. I learned very early that he'd hit first and then ask questions later. If he wanted to teach me a lesson when I did something wrong, he'd whip me with a navy belt that had a metal buckle. Another punishment, since I was short, was picking me up by my hair. For minor offenses, he'd put me in a chair and not let me move for 2 hours. My mother sat on the sidelines and acquiesced to him. But when the 2 of us were alone, she taught me preschool skills and little prayers and blessings like God is great, God is good, we thank him for our food. She was self-taught and an avid reader, and when she was reading a book, she would get so involved in it, the house could fall in on her. My father's strictness and punishment showed only one side of him, because he was loving in his own way, and he had my well-being at heart. Whenever he could, he'd spend time with me playing ball and that sort of thing. And some of my earliest memories are the walks in the woods we took. For years, everybody who knew me would say, "Just take Harry out in the woods and he'll be satisfied." Some of my other happiest moments were spent with my dog Flip, and I soon discovered, as the saying goes, that a dog can be a man's best friend. I've never forgotten the heartbreak I felt when my mother put Flip in a pound and said, to make it easier for me, that she'd taken him to a farm. That didn't help my heartbreak at losing my best friend, so after I was despondent for a week, she tried to get him back. Unfortunately, he'd been taken, so my parents promised we'd get a new dog. Later, we found Lucky, a lovable mutt who resembled Flip, with his long black hair and curled tail. While we were still in Lodi, Ronnie was born on March 24th, 1961. He was outgoing from the first, and my mother used to tell me he was known as the mayor of Avenue F because of his talkative ways. When Eric was born on May 21st, 1964, our family was complete, and according to my father's hopes, I was earmarked to be the example for the other two boys to follow. I remember how excited I felt the day we moved to Montvale because I loved my grandmother Greer, and I knew she loved me back. In fact, more of my happiest moments were the times I spent with her. I liked to go to her quarters, and since both of us loved to read, I'd lie on her bed by the hour while she read out loud to me. She could tell many fascinating tales, and while she lived in the house, the neighborhood kids would come and sit by her fireplace while she told eerie stories in her theatrical way. Before she told the stories, and when nobody saw her do it, she'd put what we called magic into the fireplace. Then, when her stories got to a punchline, the magic would explode. We loved to smell her incense, too, and we thought she was wonderful. But my father hated that incense and felt my grandmother was odd. She was a fairly good artist, and sometimes she wrote poetry. I still have a valentine she made on which she printed the verse, "A valiant young man rides a coal-black steed, my knight in shining armor, noble indeed. It is Prince Hatchie, and he is my love, brave as the eagle, tender as the dove. As roots the tree, close clings the vine, so doth my heart to thine entwine. Charming Prince Hatchie, be my valentine." That's putrid. But Grandma Greer and Grandma Ebneater liked each other a lot, and so we'd all spend our holidays together with Uncle John and Aunt Arden. As far as the De La Roches went, we never had any contact with my grandmother's brother, Chris, and we really rarely saw her brother, John, who eventually moved to Paramus, New Jersey, from his Union City home. We called this uncle Big John simply because of his size. He had a son called Little John, who was called by some people Tough John. There was also a daughter, Margie. She and Tough John both had children, so I have some second cousins. On the surface, our lives appeared to be good, and in our Christmas picture for 1964, we looked like the ideal American family people thought we were. But beneath this pleasant picture, a war raged in our home. On our side, my father, as I've said, disliked my Grandma Greer's ways. From her side, she objected to how he was bringing us up. His word was law, and when we'd ask why, he'd say because, and that's it. Sometimes he'd throw me down the steps for doing what he didn't like. And once, when we visited Uncle John and Aunt Arden, he swung at me and missed. But he swung with such strength his hand was bloody from the impact of hitting the wall. In fact, the ring he was wearing made a permanent hole in that wall. Sometimes his temper got so out of hand we'd be punished for something we didn't do just because we were there. Later, if he felt that he'd been wrong, he'd try to make up for it, and just by the way he did something for you, you'd know that he was sorry. He never said, "I'm sorry," though. That wasn't in his nature. Because of their differing set ideas, he and grandmother fought, and soon there were constant conflicts and open battles between them. My mother, in a passive way, tried to keep peace in the house. 2 years after we moved, however, hostilities grew so bitter my grandmother conveyed her interest in the property to my Uncle John. This complicated financial matters, and there were even more fights. My father openly disliked Uncle John for standing up for my grandmother, so as relationships dwindled, Uncle John always visited us when my father wasn't home. My father also refused to keep on getting my grandmother's medications. There's the family. So either Aunt Arden or Uncle John had to do that again. Eventually, my mother yielded completely to my father's wishes, and I'd hear my grandmother on the phone asking Aunt Arden to take her to the doctors, because my mother had indicated she couldn't continue to do that. Sometimes she'd call Aunt Arden for food, and on those times she'd say, "Mary Jane forgot my things when she shopped today." I was too young to do anything, but I wasn't too young to see that slowly but surely Grandma Greer was being forced out of the house. I heard more fights than my parents knew, and later, when I was older, I learned that on one Saturday night my uncle and aunt were served with a summons instituted by my parents, stating my mother and father were taking my Grandma Greer to court to get her out of the house. There were many legal hassles I didn't understand. But I know, among some other things, my father itemized his expenses for taking care of the house from the time we moved to Montvale till he started the legal action. Finally, the matter was settled without going to court. But the day my black-haired Grandma Greer, with her wise and loving ways, went out of the Montvale house for good, something went out of my life. Uncle John found an apartment for her close to where he lived, but my parents wouldn't take us to visit, and I never saw her again. She used to phone my mother and beg her to bring us down, and after she died, with a broken heart, one closet in her apartment was filled with wrapped-up presents for Eric, Ronnie, and me. There were gifts for every occasion since she'd moved out of the house, in the hope my mother would change her mind and let her see us again. That day never came, however, and when she died, she said in her will, "I leave nothing to my daughter for reasons known to her and me." Everyone but my father went to her funeral, however, and for a short time after that, we occasionally saw Uncle John and Aunt Arden. All of us went to visit them when their daughter Kimberly was born, since in some ways she was the daughter of my mother never had. Later at Christmas time one year, we all spent an evening together, but after that visit to their home, my parents never called them again. For years, I didn't see the Greers, and they never heard from me until I phoned one Sunday and said in a broken voice, "Uncle John, this is Harry. I'm at the Montvale police station, and Mom and Dad and Eric are dead." And that's the end of, I believe it's chapter 2. I don't really know what these designations are. If you want to see the photos. There's Herrick and Airy. Harry and Eric in 65, Harry Jr. and Ronnie in 64. I think there was another photo in there somewhere. Harry Jr., Eric, Mary Jane, and Ronnie in Lodi, New Jersey. Christmas, blah, 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 blah. All right, that's all. Goodbye.